This is the first in a series of talks that I've entitled My Spiritual Journey. Basically, I will hope to recall how I discovered the Orthodox Church and what happened after I had been received into Orthodoxy. Let me begin with the first of my distinctively religious memories. I must have been about 5 or 6 years old, and I was standing in front of the Abbey in Bath. The Abbey is a early 16th century building, and on the west front there is represented in stone Jacob's ladder, running right up from the ground level to the top of the building, showing actually 2 ladders, one with the angels going up and the other with the angels coming down. I recall distinctly standing at the bottom of the west front, gazing up this stone ladder with the angels, and it seemed to me to extend to a very great height. That is perhaps my first distinctively religious memory. It would be a little pretentious to call it a mystical experience, but certainly it is something that I have remembered after all these years. The feeling of awe and wonder that I had, the idea of a ladder reaching from earth to heaven, Jacob's ladder, appealed deeply to me. I have continued to think in terms of a ladder uniting heaven and earth ever since then. I have thought of the Church as heaven on earth, and more particularly of the Holy Eucharist, the Divine Liturgy, as heaven on earth. The liturgy makes present the realities of heaven to us on earth. In the Divine Liturgy, God comes down to us, humans, and we humans ascend up to the divine realm. So the idea of a ladder joining earth and heaven has remained in my mind as a dominant religious experience from my first years. Now, as you may gather from this early intimation of the divine, I was born and brought up into an observant Christian family. My parents were practicing Anglicans. Therefore, from an early age, I was taken to church. In my first 7 years, I was looked after by a nanny. I knew her much better than my parents, and she was a devout evangelical Anglican. When many years later she died, as she was in her 80s, as she lay in her bed, she said clearly and distinctly to her sister who was sitting beside her, "The blood of Jesus cleanses us from all sin." And then she closed her eyes and died. Impressive last words, and good that she died with a clear mind and a clear sense of the redeeming work of our Saviour. That may convey a little of the atmosphere in which I spent my early years, cared for by my nanny, to whom I was deeply devoted. For many years I wrote to her every week. I do not ever remember her raising her voice in anger when she looked after me, and certainly she never used physical punishment. I was never smacked. But I had a great desire to please her, and so it wasn't necessary. Now, when I was sent to boarding school at the age of 8, my religious upbringing was continued. Actually, initially I was quite upset about being sent to boarding school. It was the custom among English families of the upper or the upper middle classes to send away their children, the boys at any rate, to boarding school from the age of 8. I think that is much too young to be torn away from your family for a term that lasted 3 months, and that seems an age when you are small. So I do remember missing my home deeply, but we were encouraged to keep up appearances, not to show our feelings. During our recreation periods, I would go out into the garden and to some secret place where I could weep quietly, but I wouldn't have done that in front of my fellow schoolboys. Anyway, my boarding school had a clear Christian direction. We had daily prayers together, and the first 30 minutes of lessons each morning were spent on scripture study. Therefore, by the age of about 12, I had quite a detailed knowledge of what was present in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. And I am grateful for that background. I don't suppose people today would receive that kind of religious training, but I valued it. Despite being unhappy initially at my prep school, the first boarding school I went to, I settled down after a time. And certainly the second school I attended, public school, from the age of 13 to 18, Westminster School in the centre of London, was somewhere where I felt very much at home. I look back on that as a happy period of my life, a time of blessings. I was fortunate that by the standards of that time, Westminster was relatively liberal. Very little use of corporal punishment, very little fagging, by which I mean senior boys having the right to make junior boys do jobs for them like polishing their shoes. There was very little of that. The external discipline was not oppressive. We were encouraged rather than coerced. I loved being close to Westminster Abbey. I came to appreciate deeply the choral services in the Abbey Church. That is one of the great treasures of the Anglican tradition in Britain. The choral tradition, choir schools in the cathedrals, and daily sung services. That is something I don't think found to the same extent in any other Christian body. And fortunately, despite all the economic pressures of this world, the Anglican Church in Great Britain, at any rate, has preserved this as a living way of prayer. And in becoming Orthodox, I did not feel in any way that I was rejecting my Anglican past. And more particularly, I have continued to love the tradition of choral services, which I go to when I can. Now, what was my first contact then with the Orthodox Church? In my first year at Westminster, when I would have been 13, I remember that a Russian, Nicholas Zernov, came to address the main society in the school, the Political and Literary Society, Paul and Litzok as we called it. Nicholas Zernov was a pioneer in spreading the knowledge of the Orthodox world in Britain. For many years he was secretary of the Anglo-Orthodox Fellowship of St Alban and St Sergius in London, and after that he was lecturer in Eastern Orthodox culture in the University of Oxford. He was invited to Paul and Litzok by someone who influenced my life very considerably, Donald Alchin, who was 4 years older than me. He was in his last year when I was in my first, and he was the secretary of Paul and Litzok, and he had an interest in the Orthodox world that continued throughout his life as an Anglican priest. In later years I came to know him very well. Even in my school days, despite the difference in age, which has a big significance at a boarding school, I remember he took a kindly interest in my affairs. For some reason, I went to him and said I would like to attend the talk given by Nicholas Zernov. I don't know why I was attracted. I don't recall at that age having any conscious interest in orthodoxy, but it must have existed there. It's strange how some of the decisive decisions in our life are made for reasons that we cannot now recall. At any rate, I asked to go to this meeting, and Donald replied, a little severely, but in a kind way, juniors, that would be those of us who are in our first year at school, our juniors are not usually allowed to attend the meetings of Paul and Litzok. But he said, I will ask the president whether you might be invited. And after a bit he came back to me and said, yes, you may come. I attended the meeting. I'm sorry that this story has an anticlimax. I cannot remember anything that Nicholas Zernov said. I remember his face, I remember the intonation of his voice, but what he actually talked about, I don't know. I think he was speaking about the persecution of the church in Russia and its contemporary situation. We are speaking of the year 1947 or 48. At any rate, that was the beginning of my contact with Orthodoxy, a rather distant contact. But somehow, from that talk by Nicholas, who later became, again, like Donald Allchin, a close personal friend, a seed was sown, which later yielded a lengthy harvest. My second contact with Orthodoxy came in my last year at school, when I would have been 17, in the year 1952. And this was much more decisive for my future than my hearing Nicholas speak. I was wandering one Saturday afternoon through a part of London that I hadn't previously explored, near Victoria Station. I came across a church, Victorian Gothic building, that I had never noticed before. And out of curiosity, I decided to go into the church. I remember that it was a hot summer's day with brilliant sunshine. I also remember there was no proper church notice board outside. The Orthodox in the West are not very good about public relations. There was a brass notice saying on the door saying Russian Church. I pushed the door and it opened. I entered the church. At first I could see nothing, because it was a dark building coming in from the brilliant sunshine. My eyes took time to adapt. At first I thought, this church is completely empty, because in the main part of the church there were no pews, merely an expanse of polished floor. Then I realized the church is not completely empty. Round the walls there are icons hanging, with lighted lamps in front of them. Across the east end there is a screen of icons with burning candles before them. I realized that there were a few people standing in the church, mainly elderly, mainly standing near the walls. Not many chairs. Then I became aware that there was a choir, a small choir, singing somewhere out of view. I had in fact come in during the vigil service that in the Russian Orthodox tradition is held each Saturday evening. After a time a deacon emerged from behind the screen and intoned a litany, then went back again. A little later on, two priests with long beards appeared. I then had an overwhelming impression, quite different from my initial impression. Instead of feeling this building is empty, there is nobody here, I had an overwhelming sense of presence. This building is full, I felt, full of invisible persons whom are taking part in this service with me. I felt that we, the small visible congregation, were being taken up into an action far greater than ourselves. I became convinced the angels are present, the saints are present, The total company of heaven is present. The Mother of God, Christ himself. They are all here with us, joining in our prayer. In that way, I had a sense of heaven on earth. Jacob's ladder, if you like. Jacob's ladder expressed in an act of worship. Much later on, I read the story in the Russian primary chronicle of the conversion of Prince Vladimir of Kiev. He sent out emissaries to different parts of the world to discover what was the true religion. And at first they were disappointed. They went to the Muslims, but then they learned from the Muslims we are not allowed to drink alcohol, and the Russians said that would never do for us Russians. And they went on to services of the Latin West, and here they were more content, but they'd found the services lacking in beauty, so the account goes. Finally they went to Constantinople, and the Greeks took them to the great church of Hagia Sophia, Holy Wisdom, and there they attended the Divine Liturgy. Reporting back to Prince Vladimir, they said, "We knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth, for surely there is nowhere on earth where there is such beauty. Only this we know, that God dwells there among humankind, and that their worship surpasses that of all other places, for we can never forget that beauty." This emphasis on spiritual beauty, the beauty of divine worship, is very characteristic of Orthodoxy, and particularly of the Russian people. When I went to the Russian church that Saturday evening in the summer of 1952, I knew nothing about the story of the conversion of Vladimir. I only read about it years later, and I was startled with a sense of recognition. That is exactly what I felt when I went in to the church. I knew not whether I was in heaven or on earth. From that moment, I longed to become a member of the Orthodox Church. I felt that I had come home. This is where I belong. That was my feeling. Yes, I didn't know anything much about the Orthodox Church. I do remember our school chaplain giving us a talk once about the different Christian churches and mentioning Orthodoxy. But still, it's true that we often fall in love with something or someone before we know much about them. And so it was for me. This is my true home, I felt. So that was my first real contact with Orthodoxy. And I'm glad that it came about through attending an act of worship, not through talking with other Orthodox, for though I'd listened to Nicholas Zernov, I didn't talk with him. Not through reading books, for I don't remember at that stage reading books about Orthodoxy. No, my contact came about through attending an act of worship. And that perhaps is the best way to start. If we want to know about a Christian tradition not our own, or even a non-Christian tradition, the best way to start is to have some experience of their worship. Not to limit ourselves to a theoretical knowledge of their history and beliefs, but rather to have a direct personal experience of how they pray. What is their sense of the sacred? In what spirit do they stand before the living God? That is the best way to begin if we want to understand other Christians or other faiths. Begin by experiencing them as a way of prayer. And that was how my Orthodox experience began. But I waited. I was not received at once into the Orthodox Church. I thought to myself, perhaps you've been over-influenced by an experience that was primarily emotional. Perhaps you have a kind of idealized romantic idea of what Orthodoxy is. You must learn much more about it before you actually become Orthodox. So in fact I waited 6 years, from 1952 to 1958, before I was eventually received into the Orthodox Church. Soon after my initial experience of that service in London, the vigil service in the Church of St. Philip's, Buckingham Palace Road, I went up to the University of Oxford. There for 4 years I read classics, acquired a good knowledge of classical Greek, which stood me in excellent stead in later life when I came to study the Fathers. And after 4 years of classical studies, I continued with 2 years of theology at Oxford. And it was only during my second year of theology that I actually joined the Orthodox Church. But during those 6 years in the university, I had many opportunities to meet other Orthodox, not only Nicholas Zernov and his wife Militsa, but others in Oxford who belonged chiefly to the Russian community, and I remember their friendship with gratitude, particularly Dmitry Obolensky, an outstanding Byzantine scholar, and his wife Elizabeth, and others who treated me with kindness. Let me emphasize that from the Orthodox side there was no proselytism. On the contrary, when I went to different Orthodox to talk with them about joining the Orthodox Church, their immediate reaction was to dissuade me. Of course, they said, we believe that the Orthodox Church is the true church, that there is a fullness there to be found that does not exist in any other Christian community. But, on the other hand, we are a church for immigrants, and so they were at that time. We are a church, they said, for Greeks, Russians, Serbs, who have left their own country. And at that time, in the 1950s, there was not a single church in Britain, Orthodox church, which used English in its Sunday services. And quite rightly, they did not think they should accept English people unless they were able to look after them pastorally. And many of them felt, no, it is our duty to minister to Greeks, Russians, Serbs, but not to English. That was the outlook in those days. Now the situation is very different. But when I persisted, then eventually they said, all right. But I had quite a lengthy journey. I went to see the Greek bishop in London, Bishop James Virvos of Apamea. He was the assistant bishop who ministered in the Greek cathedral in London. He said to me, the Anglican Church is a very good church. We have friendly relations with the Anglicans. You stay Anglican. That's where you belong. He was a kind man, but I think behind his words there lay two motives. The first was that he thought that if the Orthodox started receiving Anglicans, then that would make friendly relations between the two communions more difficult. So there he was influenced by ideas of ecumenism. He would also have been influenced by nationalism. He saw Orthodoxy as closely linked with Greeks, and he thought, well, it's for Greek people. And yes, in more recent times certain other nations have become Orthodox, like the Russians, but Orthodoxy is really Hellenic. I think he did have that kind of conviction, and he was not the only one in those days, or for that matter today. I was a little surprised and a bit discouraged about all that. But I thought, well, let me go and talk to someone else. So I went to the abbess of the Russian women's community in London, Mother Elizabeth. She belonged to the Russian synodal jurisdiction, what is known often as ROKOR, the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia, which at that time was separate from the Moscow Patriarchate, an independent exile jurisdiction. And yes, ROKOR is, and was then, quite a conservative Orthodox approach, and not necessarily very enthusiastic about ecumenism. And she said, it is really quite clear. The Orthodox Church is the Church of Christ on earth, and either you belong to it or you don't belong to it. She didn't support the idea that I could be Orthodox in my heart but remaining an Anglican, which was the approach of people like Bishop James Virvos, or for that matter my good friend Donald Alchin or Nicholas Zernov. They would all have favoured a kind of Anglo-Orthodox vocation. Orthodox in spirit, but visibly a member of the Anglican Church. She did not support that idea, and she said, of course, if you feel in your conscience that you should be Orthodox, then you should join. The door is open. But, she added, we are in a somewhat difficult position. We, of the Russian exile jurisdiction, are somewhat isolated from the other Orthodox churches. She was very honest in telling me that. And it would be better for you to join an Orthodox church which is not in the difficult situation that we are. And so she said, go and see the Serbian priest in London, Father Miloj Nikolic. I went to see him. He was very down-to-earth and businesslike. If you want to be Orthodox, he said, well, become Orthodox. Why not? And he was even quite encouraging. He said, yes, we could use some English Orthodox clergy. Why don't you join, and you might be ordained? And so I said to him, yes, that's just what I was wondering, that I might be able to offer my life in the service of the Church. But, of course, that's something for the future. Then he said, however, we Serbs have difficult relations with our mother country, Communist Yugoslavia. And the particular difficulties that we Serbs have, these are not your problems, and you shouldn't be, as an Englishman, too closely involved in them. It would be better for you to belong to a church which can have normal relations with the mother church back in the home country. Therefore, you should go to the Greeks. So I said, yes, indeed I know quite a bit of Greek, so that might be easier. But when I went to see the Greek bishop, Bishop James, he did not give me any encouragement, but kindly, however, and firmly urged me to stay Anglican. Oh, he did he? Said Father Nikolic in a significant way. Well, why don't you wait a week and go back and see Bishop James again? What Father Nikolic did in that intervening week, I do not know. But when I resumed contact with Bishop James, he was quite different. Oh yes, he said, we must arrange for the date of your reception. Father Miloj Nikolic was a persuasive person. However, I was a bit taken aback because no effort was made to give me a period of instruction. No effort was made, indeed, by Bishop James to discuss exactly why I wanted to become Orthodox. And so, yes, indeed, a little after Pascha in 1958, I was duly received into the Orthodox Church through the sacrament of chrismation or anointing. I was not rebaptized. I was received at the same time as two close friends of mine, William and Maureen Grisbrook. And in my opening years as an Orthodox, I was very much in close contact with them. And William, or Bill Grisbrook, was a liturgical scholar of some distinction, though he unfortunately wrote very little. So that was my journey to Orthodoxy. From the beginning, I felt very strongly attracted by the Russian Church outside Russia. I felt here that I encountered in a full and impressive form the true Orthodox liturgical tradition. They carried out the services with fullness and with beauty. I was reading recently an account by someone from Soviet Russia who had, as an adult, become a Christian with the Moscow Patriarchate in Russia. But he said when he came to the West and encountered for the first time a rock order, the exile jurisdiction, he felt deeply moved by the services and felt this is the way the Russian Church used to worship back in the period before the revolution. and that appealed to me. I was also very much influenced by reading about the persecution of the Church in Russia during the 1920s and 30s. I was moved by the accounts of the new martyrs. They are now honored in the Moscow Patriarchate, but in the 1950s the communists would not have allowed any very open devotion to the martyrs of the communist era. And the fact that these martyrs were loved and honored by the Church in exile, that again drew me to Rokhor. I felt here in the Russian Orthodox tradition, I find the same spirit has existed in the earliest Christianity. Here is a church of the martyrs. But it was, in my view, providential that I was guided in the end to be received within the Ecumenical Patriarchate. But after I was received by Bishop James, he sent me for my spiritual father, to the priest to whom I would make confession. He sent me to a priest of Rokhor in London, Father George Sheremetyev, of a distinguished Russian family, though he lived in great simplicity in a basement in a single room. And I valued his guidance. He had, in fact, a spiritual care of other English Orthodox, though the Orthodox in the 1950s were not very enthusiastic about receiving English people. I was by no means unique. And, for example, in Rokhor there was Gerald Palmer and his sister Elizabeth, who were both spiritual children of Father George Sheremetyev. And Gerald was the co-translator and the promoter of the first edition of the Philokalia, which came out in the 1950s in 2 volumes, translations from the Russian, writings from the Philokalia on prayer of the heart, and early fathers from the Philokalia, books that had a wide influence and certainly that inspired me in my path to orthodoxy. But I came to know Gerald well in the years that followed, and I worked with him and with Philip Sherrard on the second translation into English of the Philokalia that began to appear from the 1970s onwards, that was made from the original Greek. So there were other English Orthodox, but not very many of them. I felt that I was to some extent an endangered species. I don't feel that anymore now. In fact, the number of English Orthodox, though still small in Great Britain, has increased. And in very many of the Orthodox churches in this country now, the English language is being extensively used. It was not so in 1958. My Anglican friends discouraged me. They said, if you become Orthodox, you will become a lifelong eccentric. Well, I don't mind being an eccentric. I suppose this presupposes the question of what is your centre. But they also said you will be very isolated. That has not been my experience as an Orthodox. I have sometimes felt it hard to be Orthodox, but then Jesus Christ never told us that the Christian way would be simple and easy. Yes, he did say, my yoke is easy and my burden is light, but he also spoke about the need to carry the cross. However, even if I sometimes found orthodoxy difficult, I was received with friendship and kindness by very many different Orthodox, and I expressed gratitude to them. Initially, my contacts were mainly, as I've mentioned, with the Russian Church in exile, but at a later date, I came to know much better the Greek world. I will tell you about that in my second talk.